Making his debut in the United States, the Saudi Crown Prince promotes a vision of reform for his country. But his foreign policies have left the Gulf divided and Yemen on the brink of famine. What impression is Mohammed bin Salman making on the international stage? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Laura Kyle. Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman is on a charm offensive in the United States. As he meets US leaders and signs major business deals, bin Salman is promoting himself as a social and economic reformer, reinventing his kingdom for the modern era. It's part of his first major foreign trip, having just wrapped up a visit to the UK. But since his rise to power, the Crown Prince has been a controversial figure. The Saudi bombing campaign in Yemen has contributed to one of the world's worst humanitarian crises. And reports have also emerged of a plan to reshape the political map of the Middle East and fracture the Gulf Cooperation Council. Alan Fisher has more on a secret meeting of Arab leaders on a yacht in the Red Sea, organised by a Lebanese-American businessman.
It's claimed George Nader organised the Power Summit late in 2015. 5 Middle East leaders were on the guest list. There was Mohammed bin Salman, then Deputy Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Zayed, the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi, Egyptian President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi, the Crown Prince of Bahrain, Prince Salman, and King Abdullah of Jordan. Middle East Eye says Nader urged them to create a new power bloc in the Middle East to combat Turkey and Iran, and he would lobby for them in Washington. Libya was to join the group later. It's alleged Nader, a convicted paedophile, was told they liked the idea. Those at the meeting were concerned that as the US presidential election was moving into high gear, Democratic nominee Hillary Clinton would protect the Iran nuclear deal and would be less keen to abandon old alliances. But the meeting thought the Republican candidate Donald Trump might be more likely to support their initiative.
We have seen for the last 9 months that there has been a new alliance that has emerged between the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and with Bahrain as a junior party, as a junior partner. And whether or not that alliance can sustain itself in the long run, that is unclear, but there are certainly efforts to boost that alliance at the expense of the Gulf Cooperation Council.
It was reported that King Abdullah of Jordan briefed congressional leaders in the US that Turkey was the main regional threat to stability. But he later allegedly fell foul of the group for not fully supporting the blockade against Qatar, which is now 10 months old. And Jordan voted against Donald Trump's controversial move to recognise Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
This bloc that has, so to speak, emerged is not a bloc that can implement and carry out actual policy. What we have seen is that the U.S. prefers bilateral relationships with each of the 6 GCC countries, and therefore unity is essential.
Thank you very much.
Nader is being investigated as a possible key link between Donald Trump and the Emiratis, and to see if there was an attempt to buy influence by indirectly sending money to the Trump presidential campaign. Nader also arranged a meeting in Trump Tower in December 2016 that brought together Trump's son-in-law and key advisor, Jared Kushner, then Chief Strategist Steve Bannon, and the Crown Prince of Abu Dhabi. He was also at a second meeting in the Seychelles, which brought together significant Trump donor Eric Prince and this man, Kirill Dmitriev, a Russian banker with close links to President Vladimir Putin. Several embassies were approached for comment on the Middle East Eye's allegations. No one provided any reaction. Alan Fisher, Al Jazeera.
So Mohammed bin Salman is now on the international stage. He became Saudi Crown Prince last year and is in line to succeed his father as king. Bin Salman has promoted a range of reforms at home, including easing restrictions on women's rights and a more open policy on entertainment and public performances. And he's behind a major anti-corruption drive targeting the Saudi elite. Critics say the campaign also removes domestic rivals. The Crown Prince is also a vocal opponent of Iran. In a recent interview, he compared the country's supreme leader to Adolf Hitler. Let's bring in our guests now. And in Washington, we have Joe Macaron, a policy analyst at the Arab Center, Washington, D.C. In Beirut, Rami Khouri, senior public policy fellow and adjunct professor of journalism at the American University of Beirut. And in London, Sami Hamdi, Editor-in-Chief of International Interest. A very warm welcome to all of you. Joe, Mohammed bin Salman, he's spending nearly 3 weeks in the US. It's an extremely long trip. What's he doing there?
I mean, he's trying to forge the relation with the White House. This is the third meeting with Trump. We have big changes in the Trump administration now. He's trying basically to make the case for the priority of Iran, the priority of the changes he's making at home. While the initial invitation was to focus on the GCC and to unite basically the front against Iran. We have a new dynamic in that sense. I think the Saudis learned the lesson with Obama after the Arab Spring, the Iran deal. So they pushed to forge a relation with the Trump administration to be more in their interest. And now they are succeeding. You have Trump, he has a personal relation with Kushner, and you have the U.S. establishment basically trying to resist the cozy U.S.-Saudi relation where you have a larger U.S. interest in the region. So I'm not sure, I mean, he will be on the charm offensive, yeah, as you said in your introduction, and but I'm not sure to what extent they can achieve together on the international stage and in relation to the bilateral relation. But he's trying basically to forge, his first goal is to cement his legitimacy as a new ruler now. He wants U.S. recognition of this. And second, he wants to basically promote his idea of regional policy or the U.S. foreign policy, how it wants to align with the Saudis.
Sure, okay.
And there's a lot of challenges in that sense.
Absolutely, we'll look at those. Rami, the Saudi foreign minister says that relations with the US are at an all-time high, but an interesting report in the Guardian newspaper that bin Salman has been warned by regional advisors to distance himself from Trump because he's a volatile leader. Do you think the Crown Prince is heeding that warning?
Probably not. He is embarking on an extraordinary trip that represents really the second phase of what started with Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, which was the global triumph of entertainment and free market economies. And now we're having this relationship expanded between the Saudis and the United States, or at least with Trump and the Saudi leadership, into free markets, entertainment, and the war industries, which both countries are very focused on. And he doesn't particularly care about the political standing of Trump right now. They assume in Saudi Arabia that Trump is going to hang around. In fact, it's a sign of the vulnerability in the Saudi-American relationship that it is Trump and Kushner who are the two critical elements in the relationship. But this is a sign of the fact that the Saudis are still quite amateurish in foreign policy. They proved it in the region, they're now proving it internationally. But the triumph of public relations for them now is the key factor in this process. They've spent millions, tens of millions on public relations, advertising, buying think tanks, buying journalists, taking people on trips. And this probably won't work, but it gives them some breathing space. People are intrigued by this guy. He's done some amazing things inside Saudi Arabia in terms of rapid change. So it's too early to have a real verdict on him. But what we can see is the process that he's leading is a process that's largely based on autocratic change from the top, war-making in the region, threats and blockades, and public relations internationally linked heavily to sales of arms.
Sami, the Crown Prince has just been in the UK, just following on from what Rami was saying there. How successful has this charm offensive of the West been so far?
I think with regards to his visit to the UK, I think it was a well-planned trip from the perspective that he took advantage of Theresa May's desire to show the British public that she can bring in investment as a result of following her negotiations with the European Union. I think also with regards to the trip to the UK, I think it was more directed to a domestic audience within Saudi Arabia as opposed to winning anything really from the UK government. Remember that the perception of the UK in Saudi Arabia is still a country that is great, still a country that has significant influence, even if it is on the wane following the vote for Brexit. So I think when he sees Theresa May rolling out, when the Saudi people see Theresa May rolling out the red carpet for Mohammed bin Salman, that gives him a huge boost within Saudi Arabia itself. So I think the UK trip was mainly directed at the domestic audience within Saudi Arabia, but the Washington trip is mainly directed to the US audience and not just to Donald Trump. I heard the previous speaker talking about Trump and Kushner being the main pieces of the jigsaw, which currently is true. But I think part of this trip is to rectify that. He's meeting James Mattis, who was a critic of the blockade on Qatar. He's meeting security officials. He's lobbying, buying think tanks, buying journalists, all of which to cement himself and restore Saudi's influence on the institutions in the US and not just relying on Trump. In other words, it seems he's listened to the advice that was given in The Guardian that he should distance himself from Trump. Not necessarily distancing himself, but in the sense that he's restoring the relations between Saudi Arabia and the US that were there before Obama came into power, which is very warm, very close, very on board with the Pentagon, with the State Department, and also with the presidency.
Joe, presumably he'd be interested also in meeting Mike Pompeo. Of course, he's nominated to be the next Secretary of State with Rex Tillerson out. What difference might Pompeo bring to the relations? Because, of course, Tillerson was very pro-Qatar when Saudi launched its blockade, pushing Trump not to support Saudi in that.
Yes, just first to add to the guest in London, I think the difference now, there's a little bit of reservation from the U.S. establishment because most of the U.S.-Saudi communication is going through Kushner. There's no basically record minutes of those calls. Nobody is knowing what's happening. So there's a bit of frustration. So they have to basically reach out, not to make it a more private communication channel between bin Salman and Kushner, have more the establishment involved, because when Trump leaves or when Kushner leaves at some point, they have to deal again with the establishment, which have a lot of reservation on Yemen, on other points. Now to the point of Pompeo, I think the push to resolve the GCC issue gonna be weakened after Tillerson leave. They will try. I think Trump is gonna try to make bridges, but eventually the Saudi made the signal this week. They said it's not a priority for us, and we can live with that on the long term, and we prefer to have Kuwait continue its mediation instead of Trump. So I think he's gonna try to push, but he's not gonna force the Saudis to make a reconciliation.
Okay.
So basically, they try to basically appease things but I don't see a big significant shift in the coming weeks.
Just to pick up on what you were saying before about Kushner still being sort of the #1 channel of communication with the Saudi Crown Prince, is that still the case even when he's been downgraded and is standing in the White House?
It is, because the president can give him an exception to receive. He prepared the trip. He's the key person now during this trip. He's having 3 dinners with Kushner, and he's not telling everybody in the administration what's happening. He might make big decisions. He might give some concessions or hints of concessions. So nobody is really clear. He's acting as a de facto Secretary of State. Tillerson has been marginalized. We have to see Pompeo now, if you're going to make more a balance between the loyalty to Trump and is basically representing the interests of the State Department and the administration overseas. So until further notice, the downgrading of his security clearance didn't affect. He went to Mexico. He met with the president without the U.S. ambassador in Mexico. So he's continuing his trend of basically controlling a specific file related to the Arab, the Palestinian-Israeli, the Mexico file, and the China. He's still acting as if he is the #1 charge without a real oversight from the National Security Council.
Okay, I mean, that's interesting, isn't it, Rami? If, as Joe says, Kushner is acting as sort of a de facto Secretary of State, should we still be on the lookout then for his deal, so-called deal of the century between the Israelis and the Palestinians that's yet to be unveiled?
Well, everybody is expecting something to come out of Washington soon, but it's actually coming out of Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv is driving this process, and they've got Kushner and Trump to buy into an idea, this outside-in, where the Israelis make peace with many Arab countries, especially in the Gulf, and then they all put pressure on the Palestinians and force on them a deal that could not possibly be accepted by any reasonable diplomat or jurist or international lawyer or anybody in the UN. So that probably will happen, and the Saudis will push for it a little bit, but probably not very much, because the deal, as we know, what we know about it now, would never fly anywhere except maybe in Tel Aviv, possibly in Riyadh, possibly in Washington. And you have leaderships in the Arab world that are desperate for foreign military support and economic support, and therefore will go along with whatever the U.S. asks. But public opinion in the Arab world is very, very critical of what's going on, including critical of the Palestinian leadership to a large extent. So I wouldn't put any emphasis on the Palestinian-Israeli so-called deal of the century that the Americans are coming out with. It's another sign of the nature of American pro-Israeli diplomacy, which is now linked to Saudi and Emirati and a few other people in the region siding with the Americans and the Israelis. And this is a sign of the terrible imbalance of power we have in the region, and it won't last for very long, but we have to put up with it for a while.
Well, Sami, how long do you think it will last for?
I think, to be honest, I think we're talking a lot about Mohammed bin Salman's relationship with Kushner and his relationship with Donald Trump. But let's also remember that it's not necessarily set in stone in the way that we're perhaps envisaging it. I think we have to remember that Donald Trump has already called up the Emir of Qatar and invited him to Washington in April, a sign of changing his mind over the blockade in Qatar. This is seismic if we were assuming that the relationship between Saudi Arabia and Donald Trump and Kushner in particular was very tight. The reality is Trump is starting to change his mind, and I think this is why Mohammed bin Salman, this visit is so fundamental for him. You asked why he's there for 3 weeks. Because Mohammed bin Salman realizes that relying on Trump alone is not enough. He needs to win over the US institutions. Let's remember that in the beginning of the 2017, the CIA awarded the first ever prize to a Saudi prince in recognition of combating terrorism, but they gave it to Mohammed bin Nayef, not Mohammed bin Salman. And this was at a time when Mohammed bin Salman was maneuvering against Mohammed bin Nayef. The Americans were saying to bin Salman, we don't want you, we want bin Nayef to be the crown prince. We want him to become the future king. So we have to remember that bin Salman is going to Washington on a PR offensive, not just to establish a policy based on Trump and Jared Kushner, but he needs to convince the Pentagon, he needs to convince the CIA, he needs to use Pompeo's influence in the CIA to this cause as well. He needs to get the oil companies, all of them on board, and convince them that he is a better alternative than Mohammed bin Nayef, and he is the best prince there possible. Remember, Mohammed bin Salman scuppered these American plans for bin Nayef. So he needs to convince them that all of their calculations that they made, that they can put them to one side and they can now rely on him. So this is why, if we're talking about the Israel-Palestine deal, going back just to answer that particular question of yours about the Israel-Palestine and whether we can live with these circumstances, I think when Kushner and Mohammed bin Salman made their agreement whereby bin Salman would pressure the Palestinians, I don't think announcing Jerusalem was necessarily part of the deal, because that's a deal breaker. Saudi could have brought Mahmoud Abbas to the table with Israel on unfavorable terms if Trump had not announced Jerusalem as the capital of Israel. Now it's untenable for Saudi Arabia, and it's untenable for bin Salman to come out publicly and support this initiative. And I think because he has not established himself entirely in Saudi Arabia, remember he's not king yet, because he's not established in Saudi Arabia, it's not a gamble worth taking. And this is why this trip is so difficult for bin Salman. How do you appease Trump and appease the Pentagon and appease the CIA and appease Kushner and appease the oil companies and still maintain your popular support within Saudi Arabia? It seems an impossible task. And I think this is why we see this very lavish PR campaign.
Joe, on that, Mohammed bin Salman, he's got one very strong card to play, hasn't it? And that's this Iran public enemy #1 line. I mean, in the CBS interview, he pushed that strongly, and that plays in very well with the White House's worldview of the Middle East.
It did, but just to make a small observation, I mean, the issue with Mohammed bin Salman and the Pentagon established is not that if he's going to take power or not. The issue is his policy. He tried to turn around U.S. policy in the region. We saw what happened in Lebanon, in Yemen, in other places. So the issue is more not with the character. I'm not sure that they have a problem with him ascending to power. It's a fact now. But the problem is more his policy. He has to readjust, to realign more his policy to the U.S. policy. Now, on your question, yes, this is his main point. Trump has this idea of having this alliance between some of the GCC countries and Israel against Iran. So he fits well in this, but I'm not sure how much he can help. Because the Saudis cannot basically fight Iran in Syria. They cannot fight it in Lebanon or in Iraq. They don't have the same money they had a decade or 2 decades ago to basically invest. Trump, we saw in the Washington Post, he offered Saudi Arabia to have $4 billion in Syria. I'm not sure they are willing to invest this money in a country that they don't own at this point. So there are a lot of challenges, but the Saudi foreign minister mentioned the Iran nuclear deal, which is, for the hawkish part of the administration, it's a very good progress for them. But again, the Pentagon is very worried about canceling the deal. It has implications on U.S. forces in Iraq and Syria. So the point is the U.S. and Saudi interests are not as much aligned as 2 or 3 decades ago. It changed. So Trump and bin Salman now are going against the trend, against the current of how the U.S.-Saudi relation have evolved in the last decade or more, after the Arab Spring, after the Iran nuclear deal, after the U.S. presence in the region. So they are going against this. So we will see, I think, in the coming weeks, a pushback from the Pentagon and the CIA on canceling the Iran nuclear deal and its implication. And now we saw the Saudis are more endorsing the Trump view. So it's going to be a we will see a bureaucratic war, I think, in the coming weeks until May 12th regarding the nuclear deal.
Rabbi, how is Mohammed bin Salman viewed within Saudi Arabia? Is he seen and welcomed as a reformer, or is he seen as a warmonger for his foreign policies?
Well, the reports that we keep hearing, and many of which are filtered through media that are paid or owned by the Saudis, the reports are saying that a lot of young people, most of them, are happy with what he's doing, and that's probably correct, to liberalize their daily life, their cultural life, their women driving, cinemas, things of that nature. Most probably young Saudis would like that. The problem that he's going to run into is with the business establishment and parts of the religious establishment and parts of the royal family, all of whom are very hesitant about the heavy-handed, top-down, rather brutal manner in which he put several hundred business people in jail and in the hotel in custody. He hijacked the Lebanese prime minister for a few days. He made a war in Yemen. He blockaded Qatar. He threatened the Palestinian, Jordanian economies. A lot of people in the establishment and in Saudi society are not very happy with the failures and the rather brutish nature of Saudi diplomacy in the region. But internally, a lot of the changes that he's doing are appealing to younger people, but in the establishment, the business community, and among some religious conservative people, tribal people, he's definitely going to have opposition. The problem is that opposition cannot be expressed in any public way because he personally now oversees all the media. He's so what he's done is controlled every single lever of power in Saudi Arabia: the military, political, economic, religious, cultural, everything, media, everything is in his control, like it is with Sisi in Egypt and like it used to be with Saddam Hussein. So he's got this new form of one-person government, which we don't know what the Saudi people's verdict on that is, and we won't know for a couple of years.
Okay. Sami, just in the last minute, we've got much of this trip is the Crown Prince looking for deals with American companies. He's got his eye on Saudi post-oil. He desperately needs to diversify.
He does need to diversify, but I think Saudi Arabia maintains its reputation. I mean, he's launched some ambitious projects. He's got some renowned businessmen to back him, Masayoshi Son of Japan and all of these other various different businesses. I don't think Saudi will have a problem in terms of getting that particular investment. I think the problem that many people will have is with Mohammed bin Salman's arbitrary nature of governance. I don't necessarily, when we're describing his policy of getting involved in Yemen and Lebanon, I wouldn't necessarily call it policy as much as a knee-jerk reaction. Yemen, the Houthis were about to take over, and Hezbollah and Michel Aoun were about to form an alliance that would have meant Hezbollah would take complete control of Lebanon. So I think these were knee-jerk reactions more than particular policy. But I think with regards to investment, Saudi Arabia remains lucrative. And as much as we talk about human rights and chaos and disaster, Rockefeller said when there's blood on the streets, there's money to be made. And I think this is the mantra that many of these businessmen follow. Mohammed bin Salman is opening up monopolies in the country for people. He's announcing these ambitious projects. He's promised that if the Americans won't come, he'll get the Japanese, he'll get the French, he'll get the British, he'll get whoever. So I think he's making all these different wolves fight each other for the Saudi Arabian economy. He has the Aramco IPO, which he's teasing New York with, saying, I might do New York, I might do Singapore, I might do Tokyo, all of which to see who will be the biggest bidder, who will put the most money in Saudi Arabia. From a very cruel perspective, it's quite clever. Whether he'll succeed or not, as Rami said earlier, we need a few years before we can really gauge whether he's been successful or not.
Absolutely, he's a very ambitious man indeed. Well, many thanks today for all our guests for joining us, Joe Macaron, Rami Khoury and Sami Hamdi. And thank you too for watching. You can see the programme again anytime by visiting our website. That's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Laura Kyle, and the whole team here, it's bye for now.